I just finished building this modern dresser. It's made with quarter sawn white oak veneer. It has soft close undermount drawer slides, and it sits on a solid walnut base. I am really happy with the way it turned out, and in this step-by-step video, I'll show you everything you need to know to build this project. This project is sponsored by GL Veneer. Click on the link in the description to visit the GL Veneer gallery and see a wide variety of veneers to choose from for your next project. And Mohawk Finishing Products. I've been using Mohawk Finishing Products for more than 30 years. From sandpaper to fill sticks, Mohawk has all your finishing needs. This cabinet is basically a box made of 3/4 inch plywood that will sit on a solid walnut base. I'll get started by rough cutting the parts of the box to size using my circular saw. Once the pieces are smaller and easier to handle, I'll use the table saw to rip them to width. Then I'll use the miter saw to cut the parts to a rough length. Now I can set up a stop block at the crosscut sled and cut the parts to their final measurements. With the parts for the back and the sides cut, I'll pre-drill and countersink holes to attach the sides to the back. I'll measure in 3/8 of an inch and draw a line, and then measure down 2 inches and 10 inches on each side. I'm attaching the sides of the cabinet from the back. This is to avoid seeing the edge of the plywood at the back of the cabinet. I'll fill the countersink holes later with wooden plugs. Making sure that the sides are clamped in position and flush, I'll drill pilot holes before using 1 3/4 inch cabinet screws to attach the sides. Now that I have the sides attached to the cabinet, I'll take an inside measurement at the back, and it looks like it's 38 9/16, and I'll cut the top and bottom to length. With the top and bottom of the cabinet cut to size, I'll clamp them in position and attach them to the cabinet using wood glue and 1 3/4 inch cabinet screws, screwing through the back and sides of the cabinet. I've run into a little bit of an issue. The back of the cabinet is nice and square, but the front of the cabinet is about a heavy 1/8 of an inch out of square. I'm pulling it square now with this clamp, and I've tested it with the framing square. And the way I'm going to deal with this is to add a 4-inch bracket set in about 2 inches at each corner. I had a few of these 4-inch brackets. Some of them were square, some of them weren't. So I've tested them just to make sure I've got 4 good ones here, and I'm going to go ahead and set these in, and hopefully that will take care of the problem. The drill bit I'm using here is a self-centering drill bit, also known as a VIX bit. These are great for drilling small pilot holes in metal hardware. With the brackets clamped in position and the pilot holes drilled, I'll screw them in place. If your cabinet is square, you can skip this step, but if not, this option did work. The next step was to fill the countersink holes in the back of the cabinet with wooden plugs. After allowing the glue to dry, I trimmed the plugs flush with a straight bit in the router. I'm ripping 1/4 inch baltic birch plywood at 1 7/8 to beef up the front of the cabinet to a full inch. I'll also add this material at the back and sides of the cabinet, and that will make sense when I attach the drawer slides. Just a quick note, 1/4 inch baltic birch plywood is thicker than most 1/4 inch plywood commonly available at your home store or lumberyard. More commonly available 1/4 inch plywood actually measures closer to 3/16, where 1/4 inch baltic birch plywood measures just about a full 1/4 of an inch. After applying the 1/4 inch plywood to the front and back of the cabinet, I'll also apply 1/4-inch plywood to the sides of the cabinet where the drawer slides will be attached. I'm referring to these parts as blocking. Now that I've finished with the blocking on the inside of the cabinet for the drawer slides, the next step is to band the edge of the plywood with 1/4 saw and white oak. I'll use the table saw to rip the white oak edge banding 3/4 of an inch by 1 inch a little heavy. Then I'll run the molding through the drum sander to remove the blade marks and sand the edge banding to the same thickness as the plywood cabinet. With the sacrificial fence set up on my miter saw, I'll trim the front of the cabinet, attaching the molding with 1 1/4 pin nails. Before you start your next project, visit my website and check out my professional woodworking plans. The detailed instructions, along with material lists and free video tutorials on YouTube, will help you build a project that will last a lifetime. With the edge banding attached, the next step is to make the drawers. I'm making the drawers with 5/8 Baltic birch plywood. Baltic birch plywood is great for making drawers because it's very dense and has very few voids. On the downside, Baltic birch plywood is prone to tear out and splintering. Here I'm using a zero clearance fence set on top of my miter saw to help prevent that. After rough cutting the parts to size and squaring up one side, I'll set up a stop block and cut all the parts to their final length. Now I have the drawer fronts, backs, and sides cut to size. The next step is to cut a groove for the drawer bottom. I'll use a test piece, cut one pass on the test piece and all of the parts. Then I'll adjust the fence until I have a good fit with the material that I'm using for the drawer bottom. Once I've got a good fit in the test piece, I'll make the second pass on all of the drawer parts. With the fence set at a 1/2 inch and the blade height set at 1/4 of an inch, I'll make one pass on the test piece and all of the parts. Because you need a 1/2 inch lip at the bottom of the drawer when using undermount drawer slides, I'll move the fence to the right to cut the second pass. Once I've got a good fit on the test piece, I'll make a second pass on all the drawer parts. After cutting the groove in all of the drawer parts, I'll keep the fence right where it is, raise the blade, and run the back of the drawer through the saw one more time, cutting off this lip so I can drop the drawer bottom in place. If you're thinking that it was unnecessary to cut the grooves in the drawer backs in the first place, you would be right. But with so many parts, it's really easy to get confused, and this method just works for me. For the drawer bottoms, I'm using 1/4 inch Baltic birch plywood, and I'll rough cut the bottoms to size before assembling the drawers. I'm going to build the drawers by simply screwing them together with 1.5" cabinet screws. The first step is to measure and mark to pre-drill and countersink evenly spaced holes for the screws. Like I said earlier, Baltic birch plywood splinters easily, so I'm taking my time and drilling the holes slowly to avoid tear out. When I build the drawers, I'll use wood glue and tack the parts in position with an 1 1/4" pin nail just to keep them from moving around. Then I'll use an 1.5" cabinet screw for the stronger joint. Because Baltic birch plywood is so much more dense than normal plywood, I'm pre-drilling pilot holes to avoid splitting the plywood or possibly breaking a screw. Now that I have the drawers assembled, I'll take a measurement from the back and cut the drawer bottoms to size. Now I can drop the drawer bottom in place. Make sure it goes into the groove at the front. And trace a line at the back. Now I'll rip the drawer bottom at the line so the drawer bottom is flush with the drawer back. I'll add a bead of glue to the groove in the drawer front and then drop the drawer bottom in place and attach the drawer bottom to the drawer back with 1-inch screws. With the drawers finished, next I'll get to work on the drawer slides. I'll place the left drawer slide on the bottom of the drawer and tap it at the back so the location pin makes a mark. I'll then use an awl to make that mark a little deeper. Next, I'll drill a 13/64 hole to accept the location pin at the back of the drawer slide. Then I'll repeat this process on the other side of the drawer and drill a 1/4-inch hole. I posted a detailed video on how to install undermount drawer slides a few weeks ago, and I'll have a link to that video in the description below. Now I can attach the undermount drawer clips at the front of the drawer. To help align the drawer slides perfectly straight with the cabinet, I'm using a piece of scrap plywood cut at 19 inches, and I'll attach the top drawer slides first. To attach the middle drawer slides, I'm using a piece of scrap plywood cut at 10 inches. The bottom drawer slides are attached at the bottom of the cabinet. Okay, and that is looking pretty good. Now theoretically, you could fit the drawers after you finish the entire cabinet, but since I'm still kind of getting used to the undermount drawer slides, and I'm designing this piece as I go, I thought I would fit the drawers first. Now that that's done, I'll make the drawer fronts. I'm making the drawer fronts out of 3/4-inch Baltic birch plywood, and I'll get started by cutting them a 1/2 inch light to allow for the 1/4-inch white oak edge banding. I'll rip the white oak edge banding 1/4 by 3/4 a little heavy, and then I'll run the molding through the sander to remove the blade marks and bring them down to the same thickness as the drawer fronts. With the sacrificial fence back on my miter saw, I'll attach the edge banding with wood glue and 1-inch pin nails. Before I move on to the next big step of the project, I'll fill the countersink holes in the drawers with walnut plugs. I'm using CA glue here because it sets up really fast. After tapping the plugs in place, I'll spray them with a little activator and then trim them flush with the router. Okay, well now I'm really starting to make some progress. I've got the cabinet built, the drawers are built, the drawer fronts are made, and the next step is to make the base of the cabinet, and I'm making that out of solid walnut. I want to have a gradual arc at the bottom of the base, and to do that I'll need to make a pattern. To make the pattern I'm using a piece of 1/4-inch plywood that measures 3 inches. I happen to have this in the shop. You could also use 1/2 inch or really whatever you happen to have. And I'm using a piece of poplar that measures 3/8 by 3/4, and that will allow me to get that nice gradual bend. I'll make the pattern, and then I'll use the pattern to create that same arc in the base. The poplar stick measures 44.5 inches, and I'll measure from each side at 2, 10, and 20.5 inches, and I'll mark to drill holes in the center. I've measured down from the top of the pattern and made a mark at 1 3/4 inches, and I'll move the stick to that mark and clamp it in place. And then use a 1-inch screw to screw it down. And then use another screw at the 10-inch mark. Now I can use the bandsaw to cut along the guide a little heavy, leaving some of the material. Next, I'll use a flush cut bit in the router to make the pattern. With the pattern made, I'll mill the walnut material for the base to size. I'm making the stretchers for the base out of 5/4 walnut, and I'll get started by ripping them at 3 inches. For the feet of the base, I've laminated 2 pieces of 5/4 walnut together and planed them down to 1 3/4. After running them through the joiner, I can rip them to size at 6 inches. After squaring up one side, I'll set up a stop block and cut the parts to length. I'm building the base of the cabinet out of solid walnut, and I'm building the base with lap joints. I've measured and marked to have 18 inches between the feet, and I've set up a stop block, and I'll make that first cut on both sides of each piece. When I cut the lap joint in the stretchers, I'll also cut a lap joint on a piece of scrap wood so I can sneak up on the cut and test the fit before making the cut on the workpiece. With a good fit on the scrap piece, I'll make the cut on the workpiece and then plow out the material in between the cuts. The long boards that make up the top of the base, I'm calling them the stretchers, and I want the stretchers set in 2 inches on each side of the foot. So again, I've set up a stop block at 2 inches, and I'll make that first cut on both sides of each board. After making the first cut on both sides of each piece, once again I'll make sure to get a good fit with the scrap piece before making the second cut on the work piece and then plowing out the material between them to make the lap joint. With the lap joints finished, I'll trace the pattern onto the stretchers and cut them out on the bandsaw a little heavy, making sure to leave the line. Now I'll set the stretcher on top of the pattern, keeping it flush at the back and holding it 1/2 inch from the edge of the pattern on each side. I'll clamp the workpiece to the pattern and add a bead of hot glue at each end to make sure the parts stay in position while using the flush cut bit in the router. The stretchers will travel 3/4 inch beyond the cabinet, and to give it a little bit more of an interesting shape like this one here, I'm using a quarter. I'll hold it flush and centered and trace it with a Sharpie. And then I'll use a hand plane to shape to the lines. And I'll use a pencil to draw a mark in the center and use that as a reference point. For an added design element, I'll use the miter saw to cut a 5-degree angle at the end of each stretcher. Next, I'll use the drill press to drill a pilot hole in the center of each lap joint in the stretchers. Then I'll countersink the holes so the screws are below the surface of the wood when the base is assembled. Using a roundover bit in the router, I'll soften the edge at the bottom and front of the foot. Before I assemble the base, I'll drill pocket holes in the stretchers so I can attach the base to the cabinet with pocket hole screws. To assemble the base, I'm using wood glue and 2-inch screws, and I'll make sure to clean up the glue squeeze out with a wet rag before it sets up. Okay, well now I'm ready for the fun part, which is applying the veneer. I've got my drawer fronts on top of the veneer just to kind of get a good idea of where I want to make that first cut. I want the grain to run up the front of the drawers, so I'll make my first cut here, and that's going to leave me with this to veneer the cabinet. Now theoretically, it would be good to have 2 sheets of veneer because to get that waterfall effect, it would be very easy if I had another sheet just to measure in about 18 inches, make the cut, and then I'll be able to wrap the cabinet. The grain is pretty consistent though, so I think I should get a good grain match anyway. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be pretty close. But if you are going to build this project, maybe consider getting 2 sheets and then just using the offcuts for another project. I've measured up 27.5 inches and I'll make my first cross cut. The next cut is with the grain, making sure the measurement is at least 1/2 inch heavier than the drawer fronts are wide. With the drawer fronts labeled, I'll cross cut them to size. Next, I'll cut the veneer for the left side and top of the cabinet. I've got the left side of the cabinet cut and labeled. That will run into this grain, which is the top. And now I'm using the top to find the best grain match for the right side of the cabinet. And that looks pretty good just about there. To glue the veneer down, I'm using weldwood contact cement. The first coat seems to really absorb into the material, so I like to use 2 coats, allowing the first coat to dry before applying the second coat. When the second coat is dry to touch, I'll use sticks laid across the surface of the drawer fronts to help position the veneer. Once the veneer is in position, I'll remove the sticks and apply even pressure, working from one side to the other. On the drawer fronts, I'll use a J-roller to apply pressure to the veneer to get a good bond. Make sure to be careful near the edges because you don't want to accidentally break the veneer. The next step is to use a flush cut bit in the router to trim the overhang. I'll repeat the process to veneer the cabinet, veneering the sides of the cabinet first and then the top. Because the cabinet is a larger surface than the drawer fronts and I can work in the direction of the grain, I'm using a board to apply pressure to the veneer to create a good bond. The board is a piece of 3/4 inch plywood with a round over at the edge so it doesn't scratch the veneer. And this is my preferred method of applying pressure to the veneer, but the drawer fronts were too small to be able to work in the direction of the grain. After trimming the veneer with a flush cut bit in the router, I'll use a sanding block to carefully sand away any glue residue that might be left behind. For the finish, I'll use 3 coats of Mohawk's Finisher's Choice clear lacquer, sanding in between coats with 320 sandpaper. Once the finish is dried, I'll attach the base and reinstall the drawer hardware. To make the drawer pulls, I'll use a paint can to make a pattern on 1/2 inch MDF. With the pattern made, I'll rip a piece of white oak with an 8-degree angle. Then I'll trace the pattern and cut the drawer pulls out on the bandsaw. Clamping 2 pulls together with squeeze clamps will make them easier to sand and shape on the belt sander. I'm using a piece of 1/8 inch masonite as a jig, and I'll mark with an awl where I'll need to drill holes for the drawer pulls. I've got an 1/8 inch spacer holding the drawer front in position, and I'll attach the drawer front to the drawer through the hole for the drawer pulls. With the drawer front in position, I can now attach it through the holes that I drilled earlier. With the drawer pulls clamped in place, I'll pre-drill holes into the pulls and attach them with 2 1 3/4 screws. Well, I am really happy with the way this project turned out, And if you want to build it, there are professional plans available on my website, and I'll have a link to them in the description below. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.